The standoff over Tehran's atomic ambitions has now entered uncharted territory. The European Union moving this Monday to cut ties to Iranian oil with an immediate embargo on new contracts and a July deadline to wind down existing deals. Now, this comes after a U.S. bill to sever ties with Iran's banking system. Iranian lawmakers warned that any disruption to oil exports would trigger the closing of the Strait of Hormuz, where this Sunday a U.S. flotilla returned with the carrier Abraham Lincoln, accompanied by two European frigates, Britain's Argyll and France's La Motte Piquet. The Strait of Hormuz that sees 1/3 of the world's oil traffic. Now, does this all signal a point of no return for Tehran's nuclear program and for the West, where leaders like Barack Obama and Nicolas Sarkozy don't want to seem weak in this an election year? With wiggle room reduced to naught, can there be some kind of a way out for this not to escalate any further? Today, in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Iran versus the West. And with us from Brussels, Finnish member of the European Parliament, Tarja Kronberg of the Greens. Thank you for being with us. Tarja, who chairs the Delegation for Relations with Iran. From Tel Aviv, Mayra Javan-Dafar, Middle East analyst of the Middle East analyst group MIPAS. Thank you for being with us. And with us here, Laurie Dundon of the Partnership for a Secure America. Welcome back to the France 24 debate. The France 24 debate where you two have been weighing in on the conversation on our Facebook page and also on Twitter, where our handle is @FrancoisF24. Now, just to give you the big picture of all this, already before Monday's meeting, countries like the UK had broken banking ties with Iran, but winding down dependence on crude oil takes sanctions to a whole new level.
The EU agreed to impose an embargo on Iran's oil exports as Western countries apply pressure on Tehran to stop it developing what they say is the technology for a nuclear bomb.
Iran continues to defy UN Security Council resolutions and enriches uranium to 20% at COM, for which there is no plausible civilian explanation.
The EU buys 18% of Iran's oil exports, making it the second largest consumer after China. Because of the heavy dependence of some countries, such as Greece, on Iranian oil, existing contracts will be phased out more gradually between now and July 1st.
This is part of trying to get a twin-track approach. The pressure of sanctions is designed to try and make sure that Iran takes seriously our request to come to the table and meet.
The oil embargo is the latest in a series of sanctions that include a trade ban on arms equipment and technology related to nuclear enrichment and weapons systems. After weeks of talks, the embargo was formally approved by EU ministers on Monday.
Tarja Kronberg, the EU's foreign policy chief, Catherine Ashton, there, talking about a twin-track approach. What's your reaction to that?
Well, first of all, the sanction is a very hard measure, so actually it questions what is the space for diplomacy right now because the military action comes closer. I think it is important to start negotiations and use this time before the 1st of July to actually achieve some results in the negotiations. It is true that the Iranians have not answered Catherine Ashton's letter where she actually proposes negotiations. The problem there is that her letter lies out the outcome of the negotiation, that is the implementation of UN Security Council resolutions as well as the International Atomic Energy Agency's resolutions. And these prohibit uranium enrichment. And on the other hand, the Iranians, for political reasons, cannot say no to completely to uranium enrichment. So some kind of compromise has to be found, and I think it requires now very much flexibility from the EU to actually come up with incentives for negotiations.
But you heard William Hague in that report saying that 20% enriched uranium, there's no excuse for it. So what do you do in that situation?
Well, first of all, 20% uranium is not weapon-grade uranium yet. So actually the Iranians are far from weapon grade. The knowledge for 20% uranium is of course important for also the weapon grade, but there's no sign of weapon grade material. The Iranians claim that they need for this is in research reactors, and I think actually in the negotiations one should also look at the question of research reactors and medical purposes and try to find a compromise.
Laurie Dundon, your reaction?
Quick reaction. I think one of the things that's outstanding from the previous rounds of negotiation has been, will the Iranians commit to anything that's been offered so far? And there have been discussions in the last rounds about fuel swaps, taking out some of the lower enriched uranium and swapping it out, having it enriched outside so that it could be returned specifically for civilian purposes. There have been a number of efforts and attempts made to try and look at face-saving alternatives for some of the uranium and energy needs to be able to test out the claim of Iran saying, no, we're only looking at this for civilian purposes. That narrative keeps going on and on and on each round of negotiations. I think what we're facing now is the P5+1 countries, or the countries that are part of these talks, saying, we're going to sit down at the table again, but are you guys really going to come to the table with something serious? I understand they're looking at a confidence-building measure. The countries who are preparing for the talks, the EU and other leading countries, are saying, okay, what would we need to receive a signal? So what kind of confidence-building measure would we need to receive as a signal from the Iranians that they really intend to go forward towards some kind of deal? If we can get that much, that's a positive sign.
Myra Jevandafar, do the EU sanctions on crude oil push Iran further into a corner, or is this the wake-up call they needed?
I think in the long run it's going to be a wake-up call for the government of Ayatollah Khamenei, because the EU supplies buys 26% of Iran's oil, which is now in 6 months going to disappear. Another 24% comes from South Korea and Japan. They've also said they're looking for alternative sources, so that's 50% gone already. China buys another 24%. They said they already have halved their consumption from oil, so that's 12%. We're looking at 62% of Iran's customers basically walking away from it. And this is a big blow, because Iran earns somewhere between 50 at the very least, until some people say even 75% of its income from oil. This is a situation that the supreme leader of Iran cannot ignore. The Islamic Republic can live without its nuclear program. It's not an existential matter. What is an existential matter for the Islamic Republic is the economy. It lives from its economy. Without the economy, not only would the regime lose more legitimacy, I think it would create more infighting, and I think more people who are loyal to the regime now, because of their own economic gains, could walk away from it. So I think this could be a wake-up call for Ayatollah Khamenei. I think he may have already had his wake-up call before, when President Obama signed the new sanctions. The question is, can he come to the table, and what can he offer at the table? This is the most important question. Let's look at the Iranian side. I think with the crisis from Obama on one side, Ayatollah Khamenei has got serious domestic issues at home, falling again the question of his popularity. There are now people within Iran questioning his popularity, questioning his position, and I'm not talking about members of the public sitting in a taxi. I'm talking about 4 former members of the Revolutionary Guard, one of them who was the founding father of the Revolutionary Guard Navy, who himself took part in a 2-day battle against the US Navy in the late 80s. And they are questioning basically the way the country is being handled by the supreme leader. And he's at a very the situation at home, but I think sooner or later something's got to give, and I think it's going to be some kind of flexibility from Iran, because the economy is an existential issue for the Islamic Republic.
An existential issue. Nonetheless, to concentrate the minds, we could now see a round of sanctions on Facebook. One of our viewers, Al Payman, who says he is from Tehran, says 70% here are under the age of 30, myself included, most of them unemployed or underemployed. That's the recipe for another Libyan-style uprising with a little help from the outside world. That would be more than welcome. That's one viewers comment on Facebook. But Meir Javandafar, that goes against the narrative of what we've been told time and again, that that if there is a ratcheting up of sanctions, it's going to rally public opinion behind the regime.
Absolutely, this is one of the concerns where the people who were against tougher sanctions, including myself, and I openly say this, I was worried that with me and other observers of Iranian affairs, we were worried that if you toughen up the sanctions, you could make people go to the camp of the government, support the government, arouse their nationalistic feelings. But this hasn't happened. And François, this is another sign that Iran is a very normal country, just like France, just like Israel. That yes, the nuclear program is a national issue. Yes, it's a very, people have a lot of pride in the nuclear program. But just like in any other countries, people question the way a national issue is handled. And I think it's very fair to say that in Iran, probably a lot of Iranian people are questioning the way Ayatollah Khamenei is managing the nuclear file. They're asking most probably, yes, we have a right to have a nuclear program, but is the current government strategy, which is making Iran isolated, which is bringing economic hardship, is this the right way to go about it? Is this for national interest, or what we call in Persian maslahat milli, or is this for regime interest, or what we call maslahat nizam? And the more you look at it, I think the more people are saying that this is for the regime interest, which is why we haven't seen a huge public rallying around the side of Ayatollah Khamenei's regime.
All right, another word on sanctions here. There's sanctions. And then there's loopholes on sanctions. The Wall Street Journal reveals on Monday that the British have quietly been lobbying the United States, the U.S. Congress, not to target BP's pipeline project from the Caspian Sea in Azerbaijan because it's a project where the Iranians have a 10% stake. How hermetic do you see sanctions on oil being? This is, after all, oil. Meir Javandafar mentioning all the nations that might stop buying Iranian oil, but then there'll be others who buy it. And there's all kinds of loopholes and nooks and crannies in there, isn't there?
Oh, sanctions busting has been going on for as long as there have been sanctions. But yes, I think one thing to keep in mind is that the steps of the last few months, today's oil embargo announcement by the EU and the new central bank and oil sanctions by the US at the end of last year were a huge leap. So part of the wrangling that was going on in both of those two situations was trying to determine how fast they'd be able to implement, how you take such broad-reaching sanctions and phase them in gradually so you can manage to the best extent shocks in oil prices, how you can manage deals already in the pipeline, for lack of a better word, deals already underway, repaid debt payments, I understand, for example, from Iran back to ENI, all sorts of cases, new investments, things that are already in train, how you can manage what gets hit and what doesn't through this transition period. So what was important in the U.S. was for President Obama to secure waiver authority so he can issue waivers to individual countries and individual projects that get reviewed.
So he can have a personal look into.
Yes, but all of that's done in a hot political climate. It's not a free-for-all. It's lobbying can be done, but there's a lot of pressure to stay tough on Iran. So each waiver for each country is going to be reviewed carefully, and I expect there's a lot of that going on within the EU as well.
Tarja Kronberg, do you think that the West has become smarter in the way it handles sanctions when you think back to the sanctions against Saddam Hussein's Iraq in the early 90s, for instance?
Well, I don't think that the West has become smarter. In a way, Iran has lived with sanctions for about 30 years and they have not worked. And the parliament has just carried out a report on sanctions on different countries, and it shows that sanctions very seldom work. They very seldom result in what actually is wanted, diplomatic solutions. So in this way, these sanctions are very special in that they affect the Iranian economy. Whether they will bring the Iranians to the negotiation table is another question. I think it will affect the Iranian population. It will also be difficult for them in the everyday life. And the question of whether they will see the West as their enemy or whether they will say their own government as the cause of these hardships is an open question, I think. My fear is that they will see that the EU is the enemy and the West is the enemy, and they will rally around the government. This is, of course, also dependent on how effective the sanctions are, whether the Chinese will continue to buy oil, and what is the Russian position on maybe the Security Council resolution. But I think what the EU should do now is that EU is saying that we are sort of a champion of preemptive diplomacy, preventive diplomacy, and proactive diplomacy in crisis management. This is a crisis that has to be managed by diplomatic means, and this is Catherine Ashton is the representative for the P5+1. So now it's time to show some incentives for the Iranians. And my analysis is that this question of uranium interests, uranium enrichment has to be sort of compromised. It can be found there. I think the Iranians are willing to do that. I think the West should accept some kind of compromise with very great inspections and tough inspections from the International Atomic Energy Agency. Okay, so no weapon-grade material will be produced.
So there is the possibility, you say, of sanctions. I just want to get back to the point you were making about how it affects ordinary Iranians. Before we go to the break, we know there's been smuggling across the Strait of Hormuz, reportedly on the rise, with people in boats carrying everything from plasma TVs to fresh-cut flowers from the Netherlands. Meir Javandafar, are Iranians feeling the pinch already?
I think the people of Iran have been feeling the pinch. This is one of the unfortunate consequences of these sanctions, where, for example, if a family, I've got a son or daughter who's studying in India, for them to send money over, it's now more difficult. This is one of the unfortunate consequences. But I think we have to remember that the people of Iran have, since especially 2009, great deal of them have lost faith in the current government. There are people within the government, and as I said before, who are questioning the legitimacy of Ayatollah Khamenei. So if we were living in a situation where the government was popular, I think the sanctions would have pushed the people much more to the side of the government. But already, even before these latest round of sanctions, the people of Iran have been living under a government who's basically making their lives more difficult. It's far more difficult to travel abroad with Iranian passport. And Mr. Ahmadinejad has done more damage to Iran's economy than the West ever could. And this is very obvious to many people of Iran. But I think this dual-track strategy has to also include somewhere along the line the issue of human rights, because that's a very important issue for
We'll pick up on that point, Meir Javandafar, when we continue. This is the France 24 debate.
Get into the rhythm of African soccer. Africa Cup Fever, until February 12th on France 24.